question about the speed with which the fiscal deficit is turned into a fiscal surplus. Now, the reason we need to turn the fiscal deficit into a fiscal surplus is to achieve debt sustainability. It's not something that the IMF wants just because they like to see fiscal surpluses, or that we want for that reason. It is to be able, for Sri Lanka, to be able to achieve a level of debt to convince the creditors that if we reduce the level of debt to this level, then the debt will be sustainable, and to agree to that debt reduction. So there, the timing of the speed is a trade-off. If you take longer, that means that you keep a higher debt for a longer time. You don't get as much debt reduction. Now, of course, that might permit you to have more growth in the meantime. But frankly, we don't have any growth now. And I think by delaying, we are actually risking longer periods of negative growth if we do that. So, and then on the other side, if we do it very quickly, then you could have a really massive contraction, and that's something the society really cannot tolerate. So the decision about the speed was taken balancing these two forces, and that's what we were trying to do. Now, we could discuss whether we made the wrong choices, but we had lots of macroeconomic models and data that that the fund was using, but in dialogue with us, and we had disagreements, and they made adjustments along the way. But I think we just have to appreciate that it's not just that longer time is better. It's got to be a trade-off between the costs of delay and the benefits of delay. Then the second point is about what Ravi asked about the composition of the adjustment. In Sri Lanka's case, there's no question most of the adjustment is on the revenue side. Why? Because most of the problem was caused by a drop in the revenue. The revenue to GDP ratio went from 12%, 12.8% of GDP to 8% of GDP, almost in a year, right? So we have to bring that back up. And by the way, Sri Lanka used to have a revenue to GDP ratio of 20%. So you can do it. And the other thing that we find is that there are huge untapped sources of revenue. So we can actually introduce, and let me just give you some examples. All the tax holidays being given to foreign investors. That's a huge source of revenue. These are not exactly poor people. And the evidence that tax holidays stimulate foreign investment, inward foreign investment, is practically zero. There's no evidence to that's the reason. So then there's no justification, and parenthetically, it also contributes to corruption. Then on the expenditure, the composition of expenditure vis-a-vis poverty reduction, which Ravi legitimately asked about. And the thing again in Sri Lanka is, let's ask the question, how much of, not just how much of public expenditure is spent on the poor, how much of public expenditure is spent on the rich? Because that's where the cuts need to come from. So take fuel subsidies. 60% of fuel subsidies goes to the richest 20% of the population. So that's a public expenditure. That's an anti-poor public expenditure. If you cut those subsidies and give targeted cash transfers to the poor, then you're doing pro-poor public expenditures. The other big ticket item is state-owned enterprises. Sri Lankan Airlines. I think the debt to Sri Lankan Airlines is about 1% of GDP. Right? Now, which poor person benefits from Sri Lanka having a national airline? But think about what that money that goes to subsidizing Sri Lankan Airlines could do if we could spend it on poor people. So there's a whole host of pro-poor expenditures that can come from shifting the composition of expenditures towards the poor and away from the rich. And I would say, you don't have to listen to me. This is what the Aragalaya movement, which is a uniquely Sri Lankan phenomenon, said earlier last year. They called for accountability, the end of elite capture, and the empowerment of poor people. And that's what we're talking about when we're restructuring public expenditures. Then finally, the last point is on the international scale. Oh, I guess I want to make 2 points about the international scale. The same argument, but on 2 different points. You know, when Nishan describes these Ponzi schemes, we should also ask the question, you know, why weren't the projects of these international agencies delivering returns so that they could pay back the loans without having to borrow from commercial markets? So there's something going wrong with the actual implementation of public projects financed by international agencies. Then the second is this credibility, the credibility of commitments. And I would say that in both cases, the question should not be how should the international institutions, what role should the international institutions play? It's what role civil society should play, including the people in this room, right? In most countries, this kind of scrutiny, both on the productivity of public spending and on the commitment, the government keeping to its public commitments, is scrutinized by civil society. And it's civil society that calls their bluff when they do. Now, what the role that international organizations can do, and now I'm going out on a limb, but I have proposed this to the IMF, is that they can facilitate civil society's role as the guardians of legitimacy in this kind of scrutiny. And you know, one simple example is that the IMF is currently doing a project on corruption, anti-corruption in Sri Lanka, a review. And I think this would be the ideal opportunity for civil society to write its own report. And the IMF, that's what I propose to them, is that they submit both reports to the government. They don't have to just submit the IMF report, which I'm sure will be much too polite and won't call a spade a spade. But I don't think civil society suffers from that problem. But the fact that it's jointly between the IMF and civil society might actually bring it some impact.